When Madison grabbed the microphone at our 20-year reunion and started humiliating me in front of everyone, calling me a failure, she had no idea who she was really attacking. Because while she talked about my failure, I watched her dig her own hole. But before I tell you the story, do me a favor? Subscribe to the channel. For you, it might just be a click, but for us, it's fuel to keep searching for and bringing you these incredible stories you deserve to know. When I found that cream-colored envelope in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in March, my first instinct was to throw it straight into the trash. The elegant script on the front read, Emily Martinez, in that overly fancy calligraphy that screamed, expensive event. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the Lincoln High School logo in the corner that caught my eye. 20 years. Had it really been that long since I walked those hallways for the last time? I set my coffee down on the kitchen counter and tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Lincoln High School class of 2004 to 20-year reunion stared back at me in bold gold letters. The date was set for April 15th at the Marriott downtown. Cocktail attire required, $150 per person. My stomach immediately twisted into that familiar knot I hadn't felt in decades. Some wounds never fully heal, and high school had left me with scars deeper than most people could imagine. I carried that invitation around for 3 weeks, moving it from my kitchen counter to my office desk, then to my bedroom nightstand. Every time I looked at it, I was transported back to those painful 4 years at Lincoln High. I could still hear Madison Thompson's cruel laughter echoing through the cafeteria when my worn-out sneakers had finally given up and split open during lunch. Look, everyone, Emily's shoes are as broke as her family, she had announced to the entire room, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at my feet, like I was some kind of exhibit. The memory still made my cheeks burn with shame, even after all these years. Madison had been everything I wasn't: popular, wealthy, beautiful, and cruel in the way that only privileged teenagers could be. Her father owned the largest car dealership in town, and she never let anyone forget it. She wore designer clothes that cost more than my mother made in a month, and she made sure I knew exactly where I stood in the social hierarchy. But Madison wasn't the only one who had made my life miserable. Jessica Collins had been her faithful sidekick, the star volleyball player who could have been nice to everyone but chose to follow Madison's lead instead. I remember the day Jessica had accidentally spilled chocolate milk all over my only nice shirt during sophomore year. I had saved for months to buy that white blouse from Target, and I was so proud to finally have something that didn't come from the thrift store. Oops, Jessica had said with fake concern, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Maybe your mom can get you a new one from Goodwill. The entire lunch table had erupted in laughter while I sat there soaked, humiliated, and fighting back tears. That shirt never came clean, no matter how hard my mother scrubbed it. We couldn't afford to replace it, so I went back to wearing my older brother's hand-me-downs and oversized sweaters that hid my skinny frame. The bullying hadn't been limited to just Madison and Jessica, though they were certainly the ringleaders. It seemed like half the school had participated in making me feel invisible, worthless, and completely alone. They called me Scholarship Emily because everyone knew I was only there because of financial aid. They made jokes about my packed lunches of peanut butter sandwiches while they bought pizza and burgers from the cafeteria. During my senior year, when I was named valedictorian, Madison had the audacity to tell people that smart is all she's got going for her, and even that won't get her far. I had given my graduation speech to a crowd that included my tormentors, talking about overcoming obstacles and believing in yourself. But inside, I was still that scared little girl who just wanted to disappear. College couldn't come fast enough, and when I left for UCLA that fall, I promised myself I would never look back. So why was I even considering going to this reunion? Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was some deep-seated need to prove that I had survived despite their best efforts to break me. Over the past few weeks, I had done some casual stalking on social media to see what my former classmates were up to. Madison was now Madison Thompson Williams, married to a lawyer, living in a McMansion in the suburbs with her 3 kids. Her Instagram was full of wine mom memes and humble brags about her husband's latest business deal. Jessica had become Jessica Collins Murphy, still living in her hometown, working as a regional manager for some mid-sized corporation. She posted constantly about her CrossFit achievements and her designer handbags. Both of them looked exactly like I had expected, perfectly polished, still beautiful, still living the lives of privilege they had always known. But there was something in their posts that seemed hollow, desperate even, like they were trying too hard to convince the world they were happy. After endless deliberation, I made my decision on a Sunday morning while drinking my coffee and watching the sunrise from my apartment balcony. I was going to that reunion, but not for the reasons most people might expect. I wasn't going to show off or prove anything to anyone. I was going because I had spent 20 years running from those memories, and it was time to face them head on. But here's the thing. I decided to go as the person they remembered, not the person I had become. I pulled out my most ordinary clothes, a simple black dress from Target, basic black flats, and minimal makeup. I would drive my 2018 Honda Civic instead of my usual car. I wanted to see if these people had grown up, if they had developed empathy and kindness, or if they were still the same shallow, cruel individuals they had been in high school. It would be a test, not for me, but for them. As I sealed my RSVP card in the return envelope, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. I had no idea that this decision would change everything, not just for me, but for Madison, Jessica, and everyone else who had written me off as the poor girl who would never amount to anything. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons when we choose to open an envelope instead of throwing it away. I dropped that RSVP in the mailbox and walked back to my apartment, completely unaware that in just 3 weeks, I would shock everyone who had ever underestimated me. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly known, was that the scared little girl they remembered had grown up to become someone they never saw coming. The valet at the Marriott downtown looked confused when I pulled up in my Honda Civic that Saturday evening at exactly 7 p.m. Behind me in line were BMWs, Mercedes, and even a Tesla that gleamed under the hotel's elegant lighting. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning, a simple black cocktail dress I had picked up at Target for $39. Paired with basic black flats and a small clutch I had owned for years. My makeup was minimal, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I wore no jewelry except for the small silver watch my mother had given me for college graduation. As I handed my keys to the valet, I caught him glancing at the luxury cars behind me with obvious preference. "Thank you," I said with a genuine smile, and he seemed surprised by my kindness. I had learned long ago that treating people with respect, regardless of their job or status, was a choice that said more about my character than theirs. But tonight, I was deliberately playing a role, and every detail mattered. Walking through the marble lobby of the Marriott, I could hear the familiar sounds of my former classmates before I even reached the ballroom. The same loud, confident voices that had once filled the hallways of Lincoln High now echoed off the hotel's expensive walls. I paused outside the entrance to take a deep breath, and that's when I saw them through the glass doors. Madison Thompson Williams stood near the registration table, like she owned the place, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing what looked like a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. She was surrounded by the same crowd she had always attracted, the popular kids who had never learned that high school was supposed to end. Jessica Collins Murphy was right beside her, still tall and athletic, gesturing wildly with a cocktail in her hand as she told some story that had the group in stitches. For a moment, I was 17 again, standing outside the cafeteria, knowing I didn't belong but having nowhere else to go. I straightened my shoulders and walked through those doors with my head held high. The ballroom was beautifully decorated with our school colors, navy blue and gold, and round tables were set up around a small dance floor. A DJ played hits from the early 2000s, and I couldn't help but smile as I heard "Hey Ya" by Outkast, remembering how that song had been everywhere during her senior year. I made my way to the registration table, where a cheerful volunteer handed me a name tag that read, "Emily Martinez, class of 2004. As I pinned it to my dress, I noticed Madison's eyes land on me from across the room. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like disappointment. She whispered something to Jessica, who turned to look at me with obvious surprise. I could practically read their lips. Is that really Emily Martinez? She looks exactly the same. In their world, not changing meant not succeeding, and their assumptions were about to become crystal clear. Within minutes, Madison had made her way over to me, with Jessica close behind, their expressions a carefully crafted mix of fake enthusiasm and barely concealed superiority. "Oh my God, Emily Martinez!" Madison exclaimed, her voice pitched just a little too high to be genuine. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look exactly the same as high school." The comment was delivered with a bright smile, but the insult was clear. Jessica nodded in agreement, looking me up and down with obvious judgment. "Yeah, it's like you stepped right out of 2004. That's so authentic of you." They both laughed at what they clearly thought was a clever observation, completely unaware that I had dressed this way on purpose. "Well, you know me," I replied with a gentle smile. "Some things never change." But inside, I was taking notes on every condescending word, every fake smile, every assumption they were making about who I was and where my life had taken me. The interrogation began immediately, disguised as friendly catching up, but clearly designed to establish their superiority. "So, Emily, what have you been up to all these years?" Madison asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you still living in town? I mean, I never see you at any of the country club events or charity galas." Jessica jumped in before I could answer. "Oh, that's right. You probably wouldn't be at those kinds of things anyway." No judgment. Not everyone can afford that lifestyle. I took a sip of my water and smiled calmly. "I keep pretty busy with work," I said simply, not offering any additional details. This seemed to frustrate them, and I could see them exchanging glances, clearly expecting me to elaborate about my presumably modest job. Madison pressed harder. "Oh, that's nice. What kind of work? Are you are you working retail or something?" "There's nothing wrong with that, of course. Honest work is honest work." Her patronizing tone made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression neutral. More of our former classmates began to gather around, drawn by the spectacle of the popular girls catching up with the school outcast. I recognized most of them. The same faces that had laughed at Madison's cruel jokes 20 years ago were still orbiting around her like planets around the sun. Tom Bradley, who had been the quarterback, now sported a beer belly and a receding hairline, but still carried himself like he ruled the school. "Holy crap, is that Emily Martinez?" he said loudly, clapping me on the shoulder like we had been best friends. "Man, you look exactly the same." "That's wild." Linda Patterson, who had been Madison's co-captain on the cheerleading squad, giggled as she joined the group. "Emily, oh wow, this is such a blast from the past. You're like a time capsule." Their comments were supposedly friendly, but the underlying message was clear. While they had all grown, changed, and presumably succeeded in life, I had remained frozen in time, the same poor, unremarkable girl they remembered. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, with each comment more condescending than the last. They talked about their impressive careers, their expensive houses, their luxury vacations, and their children's private school achievements, all while including me with comments like, "But I'm sure you understand," and though that's probably not really your world. Jessica mentioned her recent promotion to regional manager, and Madison bragged about her husband's law firm expanding to 3 locations. Tom talked about his successful construction business, and Linda went on about her real estate achievements in the upscale part of town. Through it all, I simply smiled and nodded, asking polite questions and congratulating them on their successes. I could see the frustration growing in their eyes as I refused to play the role of the ashamed, unsuccessful failure they expected me to be. If they only knew what I was hiding beneath this carefully constructed facade, if they had any idea who they were really talking to, their smugness would evaporate faster than morning dew in the desert sun. Dinner was supposed to be the civilized part of the evening, but I should have known better than to expect civility from people who had never learned the meaning of the word. We were seated at round tables of 8, and of course, fate or malicious planning had placed me at the same table as Madison, Jessica, and several other members of their old crew. As we picked at our rubber chicken and overcooked vegetables, the conversation continued in the same vein as before, them talking about their wonderful lives while throwing backhanded compliments my way. "Emily, you're so brave for coming tonight," Linda had said during the salad course. "I mean, reunions can be intimidating when you don't have much to show for yourself." I had simply smiled and taken another bite, watching as they grew increasingly frustrated with my refusal to break down or defend myself. But I could feel the storm brewing, and when Madison stood up and asked the DJ for the microphone, my stomach dropped to my shoes. The predator in her had been circling all evening, and now it was time for the kill. "Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please?" Madison's voice rang out across the ballroom, amplified by the sound system and filled with the same commanding presence she had wielded in high school. The room gradually quieted as conversations died down and all eyes turned to her. She looked absolutely radiant standing there in her designer dress, every inch the successful, confident woman she had always projected herself to be. I just wanted to take a moment to look around this room and see how amazing everyone looks, how far we've all come since we walked the halls of Lincoln High. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and I could see people nodding and smiling, clearly enjoying the recognition. Madison's eyes swept the room before landing directly on me, and the smile on her face took on a different quality, sharper, more predatory. It's just incredible to see how we've all grown and evolved and built these amazing lives for ourselves. The emphasis on certain words wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me. I felt like a deer caught in headlights, knowing exactly what was coming but powerless to stop it. "You know, when I was planning to come tonight, I was thinking about our old classmates and wondering what everyone would be like after 20 years, Madison continued, her voice taking on a nostalgic tone that fooled absolutely no one who knew her well. "And I have to say, most of you have really exceeded my expectations. I see successful business owners, respected professionals, wonderful parents, people who have really made something of themselves." The crowd ate it up, preening under her praise like flowers turning toward the sun. Jessica was nodding vigorously from her seat, clearly knowing she was about to play a supporting role in whatever performance Madison had planned. But you know what really touches my heart? Madison paused dramatically, pressing her free hand to her chest. "It's seeing people who remind us of where we came from, people who help us appreciate how blessed we are to have grown and changed." Her eyes locked onto mine again, and I felt every person in that room turn to look at me. The spotlight was now firmly fixed on my table, and there was nowhere to hide. "Take our dear Emily Martinez here," Madison said, gesturing toward me with the microphone like a game show host revealing a prize. "Some of you might remember Emily from high school. She was our valedictorian, actually. So smart, so studious, always with her nose in a book." A few people clapped politely, but I could hear the confusion in the applause. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, and Madison was savoring every second of the suspense she was building. And look at her now. She looks exactly the same as she did in 2004. Same style, same simplicity, same authenticity. The word authenticity dripped from her lips like poison disguised as honey. Jessica was practically vibrating with excitement at our table, and I could see Tom and Linda exchanging knowing glances. Emily represents something so important. She reminds us that not everyone needs to change or grow or strive for more. Some people are perfectly content staying exactly where they started, and there's something almost noble about that kind of acceptance. The room had gone completely silent except for a few uncomfortable coughs and the distant sound of kitchen staff cleaning up in the background. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, could sense the mixture of pity, judgment, and secondhand embarrassment radiating from every table. Madison wasn't finished, though. She was just getting warmed up. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "We can't all be success stories, right? Someone has to stay behind to remind the rest of us how far we've come." A few people actually laughed at this, and I felt something inside my chest crack like ice under pressure. Jessica couldn't contain herself any longer and stood up, clearly emboldened by the audience's reaction. "Madison's so right," she called out, not even bothering to take the microphone. "Emily's like our little time capsule. Same clothes, same everything. I bet she's still living in her childhood bedroom." The laughter was louder now, more confident, and I watched in horrified fascination as my former classmates, people who were supposed to be adults, parents, professionals, joined in the collective cruelty with the enthusiasm of teenagers. "Oh my God, Jessica, you're probably right," Madison exclaimed, clearly delighted by the support. "Emily, honey, please tell me you've at least moved out of your parents' house by now." The microphone was pointed in my direction like a weapon, and I could feel my face burning with humiliation. The entire room was staring at me, waiting for my response, and for a moment I was transported back to that cafeteria 20 years ago when Madison had pointed at my broken shoes and made me feel like the smallest person in the world. But this was worse, so much worse, because we were supposed to be adults now. We were supposed to have learned kindness, empathy, basic human decency. Instead, I was watching a room full of 40-something professionals participate in the public humiliation of someone they barely knew, someone who had never done anything to hurt any of them. Tom raised his beer and shouted, "To Emily, our little reminder of the good old days," and half the room actually toasted to that. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to run out of that ballroom and never look back. My hands were shaking, my throat was tight, and for the first time all evening, I felt tears threatening to spill over. But just as I was gathering my purse and preparing to make the most dignified exit I could manage, something made me look toward the ballroom entrance. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was just pure luck. But my eyes landed on a familiar figure walking through the doors. David Chen, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, was scanning the room like he was looking for someone specific. My heart stopped beating for a full second as our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. David was more than just my lawyer. He was one of the few people who knew exactly who I really was, what I had built, what I was worth. He was also supposed to be in Chicago this weekend for a conference, so seeing him here was like seeing a ghost. As he began walking toward my table with a confused expression on his face, I realized that Madison's cruel little performance was about to take a turn that none of them saw coming. The lamb was about to reveal itself as the wolf, and the pack was about to learn that they had been hunting the wrong prey all along. David Chen walked through that ballroom like he owned it, which, given his reputation as one of Chicago's most prominent corporate attorneys, wasn't far from the truth. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, tall, confident, with silver threading through his black hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. I watched him scan the room methodically, clearly looking for someone, and when his eyes finally landed on me, his face broke into the warm, professional smile I had grown accustomed to over the years. Madison was still holding the microphone, basking in the afterglow of her public humiliation of me, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. As David began walking directly toward our table, I could see the confusion on people's faces. Who was this obviously important man, and why was he heading straight for Emily Martinez? I sat there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it, knowing that my carefully constructed charade was about to come crashing down around me. "Ms. Martinez!" David called out as he approached our table, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used in boardrooms and courtrooms. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The flight from Chicago was delayed, and traffic from O'Hare was absolutely brutal." He reached our table and extended his hand to me with the kind of respectful greeting one professional gives to another. "I hope I haven't missed anything important." The entire table stared at him in stunned silence, clearly trying to process why this obviously successful, well-dressed man was treating their failure with such obvious respect. I could see the wheels turning in Madison's head as she tried to make sense of what she was witnessing. David was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, wore a Rolex that caught the light as he moved, and carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. Yet here he was, showing me the kind of deference that important people reserved for other important people. Madison's grip on the microphone tightened as she tried to regain control of the situation that was rapidly slipping away from her. "Excuse me," she said with a laugh that sounded increasingly forced. "But I think there might be some confusion here. You're looking for Emily Martinez, right? Well, this is her, but I think you might have her confused with someone else." She gestured toward me with the same condescending tone she had been using all evening. "This is our Emily, our old classmate who never really made it out of our little hometown, if you know what I mean." Jessica nodded enthusiastically from her seat, clearly eager to join in on what she thought was going to be another opportunity to embarrass me. "Yeah, Emily's sweet and all, but she's not exactly the type of person who would know someone like you. No offense." The table laughed nervously, still not understanding what they were witnessing, but sensing that something significant was happening. David's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like anger as he processed what Madison had just said. "I'm sorry, did you just call Ms. Martinez a failure?" His voice carried the same dangerous quiet that had made him legendary in legal circles, the calm before the storm that opposing counsel learned to fear. "I think there might be some confusion here, but it's not mine." He turned to look at Madison with a kind of cold assessment that made corporate executives sweat during depositions. "You clearly don't know who you're talking about." The room had gone dead silent again, but this time it wasn't because of Madison's cruel performance. It was because everyone could sense that something monumental was about to happen. David looked around the table at the faces staring back at him. Madison with her death grip on the microphone, Jessica with her mouth slightly open, Tom and Linda looking like deer caught in headlights. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to properly introduce Emily Martinez, CEO and founder of Martinez Holdings." The silence that followed David's announcement was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Madison's face went from flushed with excitement to pale as parchment in the span of 3 seconds. The microphone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers and hit the table with a loud thunk that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. "Martinez Holdings," David continued, clearly enjoying the shocked expressions around him, "is a diversified corporation with interests in real estate development, technology startups, and several other industries. You might be familiar with some of their subsidiary companies." He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what I knew was a list of my business interests. Chen and Associates handles all of their legal work, which is why I'm here tonight. We had some contracts to review. Jessica's mouth was hanging completely open now, and Tom looked like he was about to be sick. Around the room, I could see other people straining to hear what David was saying, sensing that something important was happening, but not quite able to process it yet. "For instance," David continued, warming to his subject like the skilled attorney he was, "Martinez Holdings owns the Riverside Shopping Center where—" He paused and looked directly at Jessica, where Collins and Associates Regional Management has their offices. Jessica's face went white as she realized what he was saying. Her employer, the company she had been bragging about all evening, was housed in a building that I owned. They also owned significant commercial real estate throughout the Chicago metropolitan area, including the building that houses Thompson, Williams, and Associates. This time it was Madison's turn to look like she was going to faint. Her husband's law firm, the source of all her pride and status, operated out of property that belonged to me. David smiled with professional satisfaction as he delivered the coup de grace. "Oh, and they're also the primary investor in Bradley Construction's latest residential development project." Tom actually made a choking sound as the implications hit him. The business success he had been boasting about all evening was funded by the woman they had just finished humiliating. The room had erupted into whispered conversations as words spread from table to table about what was happening. I could see people pointing in my direction, could hear fragments of conversation as the news rippled through the ballroom like wildfire. "Did he say Martinez Holdings? That's the company that owns half of downtown. She's been sitting here all night listening to them mock her." Madison was still staring at me like I had just grown a second head, the microphone lying forgotten on the table between us. Jessica had her head in her hands, clearly realizing that her career depended on the woman she had just spent the evening insulting. But David wasn't finished yet. He rarely was when he had an audience and a point to prove. "You know, Miss Martinez," he said, turning back to me with barely concealed amusement, "when you said you were going to your high school reunion, I assumed it would be a pleasant evening of catching up with old friends. I had no idea you were planning to conduct such an interesting social experiment." His eyes swept around the table one more time before he smiled, that dangerous smile that had made him famous in legal circles. But then again, the most revealing moments often come when people think they're talking to someone who doesn't matter. The silence in that ballroom was so profound that I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Michigan Avenue, 20 floors below. Every face at our table was frozen in various stages of shock and horror. Madison still pale as a ghost. Jessica staring at her hands like they held the answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Tom gripping his beer bottle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Around the room, I could see our former classmates whispering frantically to each other, their voices a low hum of confusion and excitement as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The popular kids' table had become ground zero for the most spectacular reversal of fortune our class had ever seen, and everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades to come. David stood beside me like a protective sentinel, his presence alone enough to command respect from a room full of people who had spent their evening treating me like I was invisible. For 20 years, I had dreamed of a moment like this, but now that it was here, I felt strangely calm, almost serene. "Thank you, David," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom as I finally stood up from my chair. "I appreciate you coming tonight, though I have to admit, your timing is impeccable." I smoothed down my simple black dress, the same Target dress that Madison had mocked just hours earlier, and looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent the entire evening making assumptions about my life. You know, when I decided to come tonight, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought maybe people had grown up, maybe learned some kindness over the years. I paused and let my eyes rest on Madison, who was still holding onto the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I guess some things really don't change." My voice was steady, controlled, with none of the venom they had shown me. I had learned long ago that true power didn't need to shout. It could speak in whispers and still command attention. The entire room was hanging on my every word now, and the irony wasn't lost on me. "Madison, Jessica," I continued, addressing them directly for the first time all evening, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for not recognizing me. After all, why would you think the poor girl from high school could possibly amount to anything significant?" I smiled gently, the same smile I had been wearing all evening, but now it carried a different weight. "What I find interesting is that you've both built your adult lives around the same cruel superiority that defined you in high school. 20 years later, and you're still standing in cafeterias pointing at people's broken shoes." Madison flinched at the reference, clearly remembering that day as vividly as I did. "The difference is, back then, you had the excuse of being children. Tonight, you humiliated someone in front of 200 people just because you could. That's not high school behavior. That's just who you are." Jessica finally looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face. But I wasn't finished yet. "David mentioned that some of your companies operate in my buildings," I said, my tone remaining conversational, almost friendly. "What he didn't mention is that Collins and Associates Regional Management is actually 3 months behind on their rent." Jessica's face crumpled as the implications hit her. "And Thompson, Williams and Associates just submitted a proposal for a lease renewal that's currently sitting on my desk, waiting for my signature." Madison made a small sound that might have been a whimper. "Bradley Construction has been hoping for a second round of funding for their residential project, and they've been very patient while we reviewed their proposal." Tom was now staring at me with naked fear in his eyes. It's funny how small the business world really is, isn't it? How interconnected everything becomes when you're successful enough to have your fingers in multiple pies. I wasn't threatening them. I was simply stating facts. But the facts themselves were more powerful than any threat could have been. But here's the thing about true success. It teaches you that revenge is a luxury you can afford to pass up. Despite everything that happened here tonight, I continued, reaching into my small clutch and pulling out a stack of business cards, I want you all to know that your professional relationships with my companies won't be affected by personal grievances. I placed the cards on the table, and I could see the relief flood across their faces. Collins and Associates will get their lease renewal, Thompson Williams will get their funding, and Bradley Construction will get their second round of investment. Because unlike some people, I don't let personal feelings interfere with business decisions. Madison picked up one of the cards with shaking fingers, staring at my name embossed in gold lettering. Emily Martinez, Chief Executive Officer, Martinez Holdings. However, I added, my voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, I do expect the same level of professionalism that I'm showing you. Future interactions will be conducted through appropriate business channels, with appropriate respect. The room was still completely silent as I gathered my small purse and prepared to leave. David offered me his arm like the gentleman he was, and I accepted it gracefully. You know what the most beautiful part of tonight was? I asked, addressing the room at large now, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. It wasn't proving that I had succeeded despite your cruelty. It wasn't showing you how wrong you were about who I would become. It was watching all of you reveal exactly who you really are when you think you're talking to someone who doesn't matter. I paused at Madison's chair and looked down at her with something that might have been pity. I built a $50 million empire, Madison. But more importantly, I built it without becoming the kind of person who would humiliate someone at their own reunion. That's the real difference between us. Around the room, I could see people nodding, some looking ashamed, others seeming to truly understand for the first time what they had witnessed. As David and I walked toward the ballroom exit, I could hear the explosion of conversation that erupted behind us. Hundreds of people trying to process what they had just seen, trying to understand how they had so completely misjudged the quiet woman in the simple black dress. At the door, I turned back one last time to look at the scene we were leaving behind. Madison was crying now, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks as she stared at my business card. Jessica was on her phone, probably calling her husband to tell him what had happened. Tom was explaining frantically to his wife why he looked like he had seen a ghost. You know, David, I said as we walked into the hotel lobby, I spent 20 years being angry about high school. 20 years letting their cruelty live rent-free in my head. But tonight, I finally realized something important. David looked at me curiously as we waited for the valet to bring his car around. Some people peak in high school, and some people peak in life. I know which one I'd rather be. The cool Chicago air felt like freedom as we stepped outside, and for the first time in 2 decades, I felt truly free from the ghosts of Lincoln High School.